Hi everyone, thanks for coming back for part 2. As you can see, I believe this prophecy is all about the number 27, but I believe it's also about the number 17, which I'll get into next. And as you can see, the year 17 on our calendar corresponds with the year 77 on the Hebrew calendar. And what I had discovered was that there's a pattern with the Hebrew years alternating from years 27 to 77 for the Jubilee year. And on our calendar, up until when the calendar was changed, if you go back to the beginning of the Gregorian calendar, it will alternate from the year 17 to 67, and then prior to the calendar change, it alternates between the years 34 and 84. And you can see those dates here. For the Exodus, it was 1484 BC, and then Joshua's death was in 1434 BC, and then the wall of Nehemiah was 434 BC. So you can see the pattern alternated between the years 84 and 34, but as of the change in the calendar, it alternates between the years 17 and 67 for the Jubilee year. And so in between each Jubilee year, you have 7 sevens, or 49 years, which is 7 Sabbaths complete. So that's very important as well. That's why there's a special mention of the 7 sevens being completed. And then the 50th year is the Jubilee year, or the year of rest, or actually the year to be hallowed, because the Sabbath is also a year of rest, but the 50th year is to be hallowed. And the 50th year lasts from Jerusalem Day, ER 27, 77, up until the next Jerusalem Day, which would be in the year 78. But I believe that the year begins with the first day of the first month, which ever since the giving of the law to Moses would have been Nisan 1. Of course, at the time of the flood, it was Tishri 1. So there is a possibility this could be referring to the month of Tishri. But as of the giving of the law to Moses, the first day of the first month would have been Nisan 1. And I believe that marks the beginning of the year. And then the 27th day of the second month, I believe, marks the beginning of the Jubilee year. And I'm just mentioning that because if by any chance we happen to go into the fall feast, I just want to clarify that I believe that it will still be the Hebrew year 5777. I don't see any really good reason for the year to change to 5778 in the month of Tishri when Nisan 1 is the first month. I believe that it will still be the year 5777 right up until Nisan 1 of 5778. Okay, so now I want to talk about the importance of the number 17 and the year 2017. And this is a list I just happened to start putting together several days ago, and this is just based on scriptures that I've seen recently that come up in chapter 17 or verse 17. And like I said, I put this list together several days ago, and at the time I had no idea that Pastor Sandy Armstrong was talking about the year 2017. I had actually watched some of his videos back in 2010 when he was talking about the year 2010, and always believed that he was onto something even then, even though it didn't happen in 2010. I believe a lot of what he was sharing was valid, and I believe that the year that the scriptures might actually be pointing to is the year 2017. Okay, so these are just a few scriptures that I've come up with recently that I've just come across without even trying to look for verse 17. And there's a couple of more that I need to add on to here. One would be Isaiah 17, I just recently heard that mentioned, and then Revelation 17. And what I realized when I noticed that they're both 17 is that I believe the destruction of Damascus is ultimately a type of Babylon. I believe that's what's really being talked about in Isaiah 17, the destruction of Babylon, even though Syria is being destroyed as well, but talks about it happening in one day. So I believe it's ultimately talking about Mystery Babylon. And I just remembered there was a couple of more. There was Romans 11, verse 17, and Ezekiel 37, verse 17, which were the joining together of the two olive trees or olive branches, Ephraim and Manasseh, or Ephraim and Judah. Okay, so these are just verses that I've seen come up in verse 17 without even really trying. And then, of course, I had the tables that I did on Theophany and Pentecost. And as you can see, these came up in verses spanning 29 through 2018. And then the table I did on Theophany Jesus was coming up in verses 2012 through 2017. And that one just so happened to have 27 matches. Okay, and here's a new one that I just tried a few days ago. It's Second Pentecost, Yesh, which is short for Yeshua, Sinai, Moses, Last Day, Elect. And all those terms came up. As you can see, they all came up in ELS form, except for the word second was in the plain text. And it's really interesting how these came up, because they came up in Genesis 50, which 50 is the word Pentecost. Pentecost means 50. So it comes up in Genesis 50, and it's actually talking about coming into the land after leaving Egypt, which is what the Exodus was all about. It's what Pentecost was all about. And it's talking about Ephraim and Manasseh, which I've explained how I believe that represents the Jews and the Gentiles, but I believe it's also a representation of the restoration of the DNA, the two coming together. And so it's talking about that as well. And it's really interesting that this goes through Exodus 1:7. So you have the number 17 there. So I'm not sure if all that's coincidence. And it's talking about God will surely visit you. You see that right here in the middle of the table. And I had explained how they carried Joseph's bones when they were in the wilderness for 40 years, right up until they went into the promised land, which happened 50 years later in the Hebrew year 2327. You see the Exodus was the Hebrew year 2277, which is like the number 27 amplified. So the prophecy starts out with the number 27, and then it ends with the number 27 in Daniel 9:27 with the confirming of the covenant. And like I said, this was the 27th book of the Bible. Okay, and then one Jubilee later is when they go into the promised land. That was at the time of Joshua's death. There were 40 years in the wilderness up until Moses died, when he was able to see the promised land, but they didn't fully go into the promised land until Jerusalem was taken. That happened at the time of Joshua's death. And it was also the time that Joseph's bones were buried. And so this scripture is talking about Joseph's bones. So it's really interesting how this came up, and I'm just going to go ahead and read this. I haven't actually read it yet. I'm going to read it just now for the first time. It says, "And Joseph dwelt in Egypt, he and his father's house, and Joseph lived 110 years. And Joseph saw Ephraim's children of the third generation, the children also of Machir the son of Manasseh, were born upon Joseph's knees. And Joseph said unto his children, I die, but God will surely visit you, and bring you up out of this land unto the land which he sware to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. And Joseph took an oath of the children of Israel, saying, God will surely visit you, and ye shall carry up my bones from hence. So Joseph died, being 110 years old, and they embalmed him, and was put in a coffin in Egypt." And then it goes on to talk about the second book of Moses, which is the book of Exodus, and that goes through to verse 1:7 or 17. So that's really interesting how that came up. Okay, now I want to point out something else that's really important. This is a table that I did on Pentecost and Last Trump, and it's interesting how these verses come up as well. You see they span from 13 through 18, and it's in verse 17 where it says, "And Moses brought forth the people out of the camp to meet God." And this is where it says they stood at the nether part of the mountain. And this is something interesting that Pastor Sandy brought up in one of his videos. And he said that this word nether can also refer to the huppah. And I thought that was really interesting because you see, this is where the people stood. So it's like they're standing underneath the huppah. And I think that explains why Mount Sinai is flat at the top, because this is where they stood to meet God. And like I've mentioned before, this is a parallel to the 144,000 on Mount Sinai standing with Jesus. And Mount Sinai is a type of Mount Zion, and so you see that Mount Sinai is flat at the top, so it looks like a huppah. So I thought that was interesting. But when I looked this word up in the Hebrew, and keep in mind this is verse 17, I noticed that this word nether also means womb. You see it means low, lowest, lower parts, figuratively a pit or the womb. And so like I said earlier, this is also referring to a birth. That's what it's talking about over here where it says, lest the Lord break forth upon them. This breaking forth that it's talking about here is talking about the birth taking place. And this is something I want to talk a little bit more about. And this goes back to the video that I did over here about the fallopian tubes. If you haven't seen that, I'll put those links in the description box. And so the imagery that's being presented here in Exodus 19 is that of a wedding. It's the consummation of a covenant, a conception, and also a birth all at the same time. And that's why in Genesis 49:11 you have 3 donkeys mentioned over here where it says binding his foal unto the vine and his ass's colt unto the choice vine. He washed his garments in wine and his clothes in the blood of grapes, because this would be the male donkey, the female donkey, and the baby donkey. They're all mentioned all at the same time in verse 11. And this is also the case in Zechariah 9:9, where it says, "Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, thy king cometh unto thee. He is just and having salvation, lowly, and riding upon an ass, and upon the colt, the foal of an ass." So again, you have 3 donkeys mentioned here. You have the foal, which is the male donkey, the ass, which is a female donkey, and then the colt, which is a baby donkey. And so this is prophetic of the second coming, because as I've mentioned before, no one can ride 3 donkeys all at the same time. So this is symbolic of the second coming. And so I want to explain how all 3 of those things are depicted in this imagery over here. And I want to talk a little bit more about the importance of the year 2017. but I'm about out of time, so I'll have to do that in the next video, which may be another day. I may continue with more another day. So thanks for watching, and God bless you.